psychological horror series, The Millfield Courthouse Murders, rewritten in a more immersive, engaging and chilling style to captivate a YouTube audience. It's crafted to sustain suspense, build the world of Millfield and tease the horrors to come. Perfect for storytelling with voiceover narration and visual imagery. Part 1, The Judge, the Courthouse and the Town That Looked Away. Opening narration, soft, ominous music in the background. In the summer of 1867, a traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend Thomas Whitmore arrived in the forgotten East Texas town of Millfield, expecting to hold a revival meeting. What he found instead would haunt him until the day he died. Fade in, dusty roads, pine trees swaying, the silhouette of a preacher arriving on horseback. Whitmore had come in good faith. He was a man of the cloth, accustomed to witnessing both suffering and redemption across the post-war South, but nothing could prepare him for what he would uncover beneath the red-bricked fortress at the centre of town. 89 men had vanished from Millfield over the course of just 18 months. 89. All last seen entering one place, the courtroom of Judge Harrison Crawford, and not a single one ever returned. Official records claimed each man was transferred to a state penitentiary, but when Reverend Whitmore began asking questions, he found no prison, anywhere in Texas, that had received them. No chains, no paper trails, no bodies, just silence. And then he found the basement. Buried in the shadows beneath the courthouse, hidden behind iron doors and stone walls, was something far worse than death. Something that tore at the seams of morality, faith, and justice. It was not a prison. It was a sanctuary for pain. The town that time forgot. To understand how this horror came to be, we must first understand Millfield. Millfield was tucked deep in the pine forests of East Texas, about 40 miles southeast of Marshall. It was the kind of place maps didn't bother marking in detail. A place born out of war, desperation, and secrecy. The year was 1864, when Colonel James Millfield, a former Confederate cavalry officer, rode into the forest with a wagon full of timber and ambition. He purchased thousands of acres, claimed he'd saved the money before the war, but the locals knew better. Word around the saloon said he'd looted it from a Union supply train during a final raid into Louisiana. No one dared confirm it. In those days, questions could get a man killed. By 1867, Millfield had grown into a quiet settlement of no more than 400 souls. The town was arranged in a neat grid. Main Street ran east to west, bisected by 3 dusty cross streets. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and the Pine Grove Inn made up its modest business district. People kept to themselves, built their homes from lumber, grew vegetables, survived the best they could. But at the very heart of the town, towering above it all, was something that didn't quite belong. The courthouse that cast a shadow. It rose 3 stories tall, made of blood-red brick and pale limestone. Built in the Gothic Revival style, its pointed arches and stained glass gave it the eerie grandeur of a cathedral. But it was no house of worship. This was Judge Crawford's domain, and he built it himself. Commissioned in 1865, just after the war, the courthouse was unlike anything the town had ever seen or could afford. Yet Crawford spared no expense. He claimed the deep basement was needed to store legal documents safely from the Texas humidity. But there were bars on those basement windows, thick, rusted and bolted from the inside. When asked, Crawford would simply nod and say, "Justice must be protected." No one questioned him. Judge Harrison Crawford, the law in flesh. He was a man you didn't argue with. Towering at well over 6 feet, Judge Harrison Crawford had the kind of presence that could freeze a room. Broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, his steel grey hair always neatly parted, his black robes pristine, he walked with the bearing of a general, not a judge. And maybe that's because he was one, at least once. He never spoke of his time in the war, but it clung to him like the scent of gunpowder. His eyes, icy blue, could pierce right through you. Conversations with him never felt casual. Even when he talked about the weather, it felt like a trial. He had graduated from the University of Virginia Law School. His letters of recommendation came from some of the most powerful attorneys in Richmond. It was said he could quote English common law in his sleep. He never married, never hired a servant, never attended socials or Sunday picnics. When asked about it, he'd respond in his deep, measured voice, Justice is a jealous mistress, and she demands my full devotion. The House of Books and Secrets. Crawford lived in a two-story Greek Revival mansion just outside town. With its white columns and wide porches, it looked like something out of a Virginia plantation dream, and yet no one ever really saw inside. Visitors, rare as they were, reported spotless rooms, a kitchen that looked barely used, and walls lined with books. Not just any books. Legal texts, theology, obscure volumes on divine punishment, spiritual purification, and pain as a form of redemption. It was whispered that he kept journals too. Thick, leather-bound volumes. No one saw them, but the preacher who uncovered them would later describe the writings as the ramblings of a man who believed God had chosen him to purify souls through suffering. And in his mind, the courtroom was just the beginning. A sacred duty or a sacred delusion. The strangest thing? Crawford refused to let anyone else handle prisoner transfers, not the sheriff, not the marshals. He insisted on escorting every condemned man himself. "It is my responsibility," he would say. "They are in my care, body and soul." No one protested. Why would they? They trusted him. He had built their church, funded their school, donated land for the cemetery. But behind those basement walls, beneath the courthouse's polished halls, something dark was breathing, something ancient, something vile. And by the time Reverend Whitmore discovered what lay below, it was already too late. Closing hook. Music builds, tension rises. In next episode, we'll dive deeper into the secrets of Judge Crawford's basement and the clues Reverend Whitmore left behind in his hidden letters. Clues that would expose the twisted theology behind the Millfield disappearances. If you're drawn to stories that pull back the curtain on America's forgotten horrors, then don't just watch, subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I read every one, and trust me, you'll want to hear what's coming next. Below is part 2 of your 10-part historical horror series, The Millfield Courthouse Murders, adapted in a simple, engaging and suspenseful narrative style for a 30-minute American YouTube audience. It's paced for a voiceover with chilling build-up, vivid character focus, especially on Martha Kellerman and Sarah Morrison, and a slow descent into terror, just right for part 2 of the series.
Part 2.
The basement beneath justice. The courthouse in Millfield, Texas was more than just a symbol of justice. For many, it became the final stop before vanishing forever. And for one woman, the truth about what lay beneath that red brick building would turn quiet suspicion into a living nightmare. The jail everyone saw, and the one nobody did. To outsiders, the Millfield Courthouse jail looked ordinary. Modest. 4 simple cells with wooden bunks, barred windows, and just enough light and air to meet basic standards. Prisoners here were fed. They had visitors. Their lives continued, at least until sentencing. But there was more to this jail. Much more. Beneath those holding cells stretched a hidden labyrinth. The courthouse basement. Crawford had overseen every detail of its design himself. Multiple iron doors, thick stone walls, and padlocks that no ordinary man could open. He claimed it was used for storing evidence and legal documents, protected from humidity and thieves. No one questioned it. No one except Martha Kellerman. The cleaning woman who knew too much. Martha was in her early 50s. A war widow, quiet, hard-working. She'd taken the courthouse cleaning job to survive. Most people saw her as just another old woman sweeping floors. But Martha noticed things. She was one of the only people allowed access to parts of the basement, only during daylight and only under Crawford's watchful eye. She cleaned what he called the upper basement, rooms lined with shelves and crates, filed legal papers and labelled evidence. But even in those rooms, something felt off. The walls were overbuilt, too thick for a document room. The floors were too perfectly levelled, the stonework too precise. And the smell, God, the smell. Damp earth mixed with something metallic, something rotting, something chemical, a smell that didn't belong in any legal archive. Crawford said it was due to the soil. East Texas clay demands deep foundations, he told her with that polite smile. I followed the Virginia style, wine cellars, deep supports, standard engineering. But Martha had grown up in old farmhouses. She knew the difference between a wine cellar and a bunker. When men began to vanish... The pattern began in winter of 1866. A bitter, icy season that shut down roads and snapped telegraph lines. Travel was impossible. The courthouse became its own isolated world, and that's when prisoners started to disappear. At first, nobody noticed. One or two gone here and there. Transferred to Huntsville, Crawford said, taken to the state penitentiary for hard labor. He signed the papers. The law looked satisfied. But behind those signatures, there was silence. The prisoners never made it to any state prison. The first was Thomas Burke, a poor Irish immigrant caught stealing chickens, harmless, alone, no family, no lawyer. Crawford tried him quickly and sentenced him to 2 years, said it would purify his soul. Burke vanished that very night. No one saw a wagon, no one saw chains, just gone. Martha's doubts grew. Martha started noticing more. No transport tracks behind the courthouse, no mud on the floors, no overnight activity, despite Crawford claiming prisoners were moved at night to protect their dignity. She'd expected paperwork, footprints, something, but found nothing. When she gently asked Crawford about it, his smile tightened. "I take pride in leaving no trace of these unpleasant necessities," he said. "The people shouldn't be burdened by the ugliness of criminal punishment." But as the weeks passed, the courthouse windows glowed later into the night. Martha watched them from her tiny cabin out back. The lamplight flickered in those windows long past midnight. And then came the sounds! Not building creaks or rats in the walls. These were human sounds. Moaning, muffled voices, sometimes crying. When Martha asked about them, Crawford laughed softly. "Old buildings do strange things in winter," he said. "Stone carries sound. Could be anything. Probably rats." But Martha knew the sound of pain. She'd heard it during the war. She'd heard it when her husband died. And she was hearing it now, beneath her own feet. The prisoners who were never seen again. One by one, the names mounted. Jacob Mueller, a German farmer convicted of assault, vanished. Benjamin Hawkins, a young man from a wealthy family, disappeared after sentencing. Samuel Morrison, deacon of the Methodist Church, gone without a trace. Each case had official paperwork. Each had Crawford's signature. But the prisons had no record. No transports arrived, no prisoners checked in, and more importantly, none ever wrote home. Sarah Morrison begins to fight back. Samuel Morrison's wife, Sarah, wasn't like the others. She was smart, determined. She'd run her farm alone during the war, and she didn't scare easy. When Crawford told her her husband had been transferred to Huntsville, she rode there herself, spoke with the warden, showed the court documents, and the warden shook his head. "We've never seen your husband. We've received no one from Millfield in over a year." Sarah went back to Millfield, furious. Every week she came to the courthouse. Every week she demanded answers. "Where is my husband, Judge Crawford? You said you transferred him, but the prison says otherwise," Crawford, calm as ever, replied. "Mrs. Morrison, the war disrupted many systems. Records get lost. Bureaucracies are slow. Your husband was legally sentenced and transferred. I did my duty." But Sarah wasn't buying it. She began traveling to towns across East Texas, interviewing families, gathering letters, visiting churches and farms and courtrooms. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. The pattern becomes clear. Over 30 men, all sentenced in Millfield, all vanished. No transports, no prison logs, just Crawford's word. Sarah brought the information to the sheriff, to pastors, to merchants. But Crawford was the law in Millfield. And the town had been looking the other way for too long. Even the local blacksmith began whispering. He'd supplied Crawford with chains, locks, surgical instruments, and strange metal tools, far more than any courthouse should ever need. And Martha? She'd been keeping her own secret journal, writing down names, dates, sounds, smells. The smell of blood, decay, and lime rising from the basement. The feeling that the earth beneath her had become a crypt. And when she confronted Crawford one last time, the mask finally cracked. "Mrs. Kellerman," he said coldly, stepping closer, "you would do well to mind your place. The matters I oversee are not for your understanding. What lies beneath this courthouse is none of your concern." Martha never brought it up again, but she kept writing.
Every day. Closing hook. Music rising.
By spring of 1867, the truth was no longer a whisper. It was a scream buried in stone. The people of Millfield were beginning to suspect that justice wasn't being served. It was being buried alive. Part 3 of your 10-part horror series, The Millfield Courthouse Murders, written in an engaging, immersive and chilling tone, perfect for a 30-minute YouTube episode. This part focuses on Judge Crawford's private theology, his handwritten journals, and Reverend Whitmore's first steps into darkness. Part 3, Divine Justice and the Devil's Work.
Intro narration.
By the spring of 1867, 2 women in Millfield had begun unravelling a mystery the town had buried for over a year. But to truly understand the nightmare unfolding beneath the courthouse, we must step into the mind of the man behind it all, Judge Harrison Crawford, and his sacred mission to purify souls. The journals beneath the floorboards. When Reverend Thomas Whitmore came to Millfield, he thought he was just passing through. A revival meeting, a few sermons, blessings and baptisms. That's all it was supposed to be. But shortly after arriving, he met Sarah Morrison, who placed in his hands a collection of letters, notes and one very worn notebook, Martha Kellerman's private journal. Martha had disappeared just 2 weeks earlier, vanished from her cabin behind the courthouse without a trace. Her disappearance had gone unreported, unnoticed by most, but her writings told a terrifying story. She had been documenting everything, the smells from the basement, the sounds, the men who disappeared, the false prison records. She even described Crawford's erratic behaviour. But it was the final entry that froze Whitmore in his tracks. He knows I hear them. He knows I smell the blood. I saw the light again tonight from under the basement door. God help me, I think I heard a man praying and then screaming. I don't think I'll be here much longer. Whitmore's visit to Crawford's house. Reverend Whitmore decided to speak with Judge Crawford directly. It was a Sunday afternoon when he knocked on the door of the judge's grand white-columned house. Crawford answered in a black suit, his expression unreadable. They sat in the judge's study, a room filled wall to wall with books. Theology, law, philosophy. The windows were covered in heavy curtains. The air was heavy, still. Whitmore noticed one book laid open on Crawford's desk. Suffering and Redemption in Early Church Doctrine. A passage had been underlined in red ink. The fire that cleanses the soul must be hotter than the fire that damns it. Their conversation was brief, chilling. Whitmore. Judge, there are troubling rumours surrounding the courthouse basement. People are afraid. Fear is the beginning of wisdom, Reverend. Justice, like salvation, is not always gentle. And the disappearances? I've done what the law requires, what God requires. The rest is beyond your understanding. Whitmore left unsettled, but something in the judge's eyes, a flicker of pride, of something darker, compelled him to act. The secret room in the courthouse. That night, Whitmore returned to the courthouse. The building was locked, of course, but he'd been given a spare key by Sarah Morrison, whose husband had once helped install the back door. Whitmore crept through the empty halls, guided by the weak flame of his oil lantern, down the main staircase, through the records room. Then he found the basement, and there, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Crawford's locked office, he discovered a box wrapped in oilskin. Inside were 3 leather-bound volumes, Judge Crawford's personal journals. The Gospel according to Crawford. What Whitmore read over the next 2 nights shattered him. Crawford had written in meticulous, perfect handwriting, like he was drafting law, not confessing sin. He spoke not as a judge, but as a prophet. The law of man is flawed. The prisons of Texas are nothing but holding pens for evil. But I have been shown a new path, a divine correction. Pain is the gate. Blood is the baptism. In entry after entry, Crawford laid out his twisted theology. He believed criminals were not to be punished but purified. He considered himself an instrument of God, chosen to carry out a holy transformation through suffering and silence. And he described each man he prosed in clinical religious terms, never by name, only by sin. The thief, weak in repentance, the deserter, still defiant, the liar, trembling before the iron. And there were also drawings, symbols that resembled ancient Christian martyrdom imagery, twisted into cruel diagrams. There were floor plans of the basement showing chambers labelled with Latin words: Cella Poenitentii, Chamber of Penance; Lacus Doloris, Pit of Pain; Expiatio, the Room of Cleansing; And then finally, a phrase repeated over and over: the flesh must suffer if the soul is to be free. Sarah Morrison's growing army. While Whitmore was reading these journals, Sarah Morrison was building an army, not of soldiers, of witnesses. She gathered names of every man Crawford had sentenced. She tracked families. She compiled affidavits from prison officials. She showed them copies of Crawford's own transfer documents, filled with contradictions and impossibilities. Her notes, along with Martha's journal and Crawford's twisted writings, were too much to ignore. She brought them to the circuit preacher, to merchants, to school teachers, and slowly the town began to turn. If a man is God's judge, who judges the man? That was the question Sarah asked again and again. No one could answer. The final entry in the journal, in the final pages of his third journal, Crawford seemed almost ecstatic, delirious. The pain has stopped. The voice has returned. The angel of the pit walks with me again. He says the work is not yet done. There are 9 left.
9!
That number would stick in Reverend Whitmore's mind for the rest of his life. Crawford's transformation. As spring deepened, so did Crawford's descent. People began to notice changes. His robes, once pristine, were often stained. His sermons, when he attended church at all, were filled with bizarre, fiery language. He no longer ate at the inn. He kept entirely to himself. His eyes, once sharp, had become distant, dreamy, as if he was living in a different world. He spoke of cleansing rituals and divine flames. His gavel, they said, no longer sounded like justice, it sounded like judgment. Whitmore's terrible realization. By early summer, Whitmore knew what he had to do. He took Crawford's journals, Martha's writings, and Sarah's testimony, and sent copies to the Methodist Church Conference in Galveston. He begged them to intervene, but Galveston's response was chillingly familiar. Thank you for your concern, Reverend. The Church cannot interfere in matters of state law or civil courts. We advise prayer and continued ministry. Whitmore was alone, and the people of Millfield were growing restless. Closing hook. Images of the courthouse at dusk. Judge Harrison Crawford believed he was chosen to cleanse evil from the earth. But his mission of purification had become something far worse, something that couldn't be stopped by law or prayer alone. 4 of your 10-part historical horror series, the Millfield Courthouse Murders, written in a suspenseful, cinematic style for a 30-minute YouTube audience. This part focuses on the town's growing unrest, Whitmore's spiritual crisis, and the approach of Crawford's final act, a reckoning no one was prepared for.
Part 4, the final 9. Intro narration, tense strings and whispering wind.
By midsummer of 1867, the town of Millfield could no longer pretend it didn't know. Not after the journals, not after the screams, and not after the Reverend began preaching about blood on the courthouse steps. The leaking of Martha's journal. The dam broke when Sarah Morrison made a bold choice. She published portions of Martha Kellerman's journal in a handwritten town circular and delivered it door to door. It included this passage. The sounds are clearer now. Chains, weeping, whispers in languages I don't understand. The judge said they were dreams, but dreams don't leave blood on the stairs. People began asking real questions. The sheriff, long silent, tried to distance himself. I only guard the cells, not the basement, he said. But when he was asked why he'd never seen a transport wagon, he had no answer. Rumours spread faster than summer lightning. Crawford's killing them. They're buried under the courthouse. He's keeping them alive, just barely. Millfield, once a quiet post-war settlement, was beginning to boil. Whitmore's breaking point. Inside his modest room above the church, Reverend Whitmore was unravelling. He no longer shaved. His eyes were bloodshot. His sermons became wild, fevered things filled with references to Exodus, sacrifice, and smiting the wicked. People whispered that the Reverend had seen hell in Crawford's journals and now couldn't look away. One Sunday, Whitmore stood before a half-empty congregation and shouted, "The devil wears robes in Millfield. He walks among us quoting scripture while spilling blood beneath our feet." That was the last time Crawford attended a service.
Crawford's silence and preparations.
From early July on, Judge Harrison Crawford stopped appearing in public. His Greek revival mansion grew dark. The The courthouse windows stayed shuttered. He missed court dates. Letters from Austin went unanswered. But supplies kept arriving. The general store delivered more than ever. Barrels of lye, wooden crates of iron tools, dozens of kerosene lamps and ropes. The blacksmith, unnerved, asked why Crawford needed so many chains. The condemned have grown wild, Crawford replied flatly. They require stronger bonds. But no one had seen a prisoner in weeks.
The final 9!
Reverend Whitmore returned to the journals, hoping to understand the phrase that haunted him. There are 9 left. The entries were erratic now, barely coherent. The purification nears completion. The first was the thief, now made silent. The liar would not repent until the blade. The adulterer screamed, but the scream was holy. Each entry ended with a tally mark. 8 so far. The next journal page was blank. Waiting. Sarah Morrison believed he was planning a final act, a mass execution. But how? And when? It was Sarah who convinced Elijah Benton, the deputy clerk, to open the basement door. Late one night, they slipped inside using a key Sarah had taken from the judge's own robe weeks earlier when she had cornered him with questions. What they found beneath the courthouse was not simply a jail. It was a labyrinth. Corridors carved into the rock, rooms lined with iron rings, dark stains and sloped stone floors for drainage. A single hallway with 9 locked doors, each marked with a Roman numeral. And worst of all, an altar. Constructed from limestone and wrapped in chains, it stood beneath a crude stained glass window depicting Christ crucified, but with Crawford's face. Sarah vomited. Elijah wept. They left the basement and locked it behind them. But they couldn't unsee it.
The town fractures.
When word spread, Millfield split in 2. 1, those who believed the judge was mad and dangerous. 2, and those who believed he was righteous, God's chosen misunderstood by lesser minds. Mrs. Dunhill, the teacher, declared from the schoolhouse steps, "If Crawford is cleansing sin, then let him. This world is rotten. Maybe that basement is the only holy place left." Others demanded action. A mob formed. Torches, axes, shouts of "Open the basement!" But when they reached the courthouse, Crawford was waiting. The confrontation. Standing courthouse steps in full robes, Crawford addressed the crowd with chilling calm. "You come bearing fire, but you know nothing of true flames. I have seen the face of judgment. I have touched the soul of agony. These final 9, will pass through the fire tonight, and then it will be finished." Gunshots rang out, but Crawford had already vanished into the courthouse. When the crowd broke down the doors, the basement was sealed. The sealed door! The hallway to the lowest level had been collapsed, blown inward with charges no one saw coming. Behind the rubble, they could hear nothing. No voices, no screams, no cries, just silence. Someone tried digging, but the stone was thick and the way blocked. The courthouse stood quiet for days. And then came the smoke. It billowed from the basement windows, thick, acrid, and foul. Someone said they saw figures behind the glass, men clawing at the iron bars. But the smoke covered everything, and by morning, the smell of burning flesh had filled the square. Aftermath and disbelief. When the fire cleared, the basement was empty. The 9 rooms were blackened, the altar charred, and in the centre of it all, Judge Crawford's robe lay folded on the stone floor beside an open Bible soaked in blood. The page it was open to read, and the Lord said, "I will purge thee as silver is purged, and thou shalt be clean." Ezekiel 20:20. Crawford's body was never found, nor were the final 9.
Halting hymn plays faintly.
Was it justice? Was it madness? Or was it something older, something dark that wore scripture like a mask? In part 5, the town of Millfield is left broken. Sarah Morrison vanishes, the church is abandoned, and a federal inquiry begins, but what they find beneath the courthouse will never be made public. Certainly, here's part 5 of your 10-part horror series, The Millfield Courthouse Murders, crafted in a cinematic, suspense-filled tone, suitable for a 30-minute YouTube episode. This chapter follows the arrival of federal investigators, the aftermath of Crawford's disappearance, and the chilling secrets found beneath the courthouse ruins. Part 5, What the Government Found. Intro narration, slow, echoing drums over low wind. When the fire finally died and the smoke cleared from the windows of the Millfield Courthouse, nothing, and no one was left inside. No Crawford, no prisoners, no explanation, just the ash and silence of something terrible and maybe divine. The arrival of the federal marshals. It wasn't until August of 1867, nearly 3 weeks after the courthouse burned from the inside out, that US Marshals arrived in Millfield. 3 men. Marshal Edwin Hatch, veteran of the war and now tasked with overseeing law enforcement across East Texas. Investigator Silas Broom, a former Pinkerton agent, and Dr. Hiram Tully, a government-appointed medical examiner. They were responding to a series of anonymous letters sent from both Sarah Morrison and Reverend Whitmore, detailing illegal executions, missing prisoners, and a judge who claimed divine authority to purify men through torment. The marshals began with interviews. What they heard was almost unbelievable. Witnesses described underground chambers, reports of screams and lights under the courthouse at night, a cult-like fixation on judgment and redemption. They interviewed the sheriff, who broke down in tears. They spoke with Elijah Benton, the deputy clerk who had seen the altar, and they looked for Sarah Morrison, but she was gone. Sarah Morrison's disappearance. Sarah had vanished without warning just 5 days before the marshals arrived. Her cabin door had been left open. A kettle still boiled on the stove. Her Bible was found open on the table to Psalm 94. Shall the throne of iniquity which deviseth mischief by law have fellowship with thee? Her notes, records, and witness statements had all been burned in her fireplace. Only scraps remained. No one ever saw her again.
The dig begins.
Marshal Hatch ordered the courthouse basement to be excavated. The rubble from the collapsed hallway was removed, brick by brick. What they uncovered was exactly as described in the leaked journal pages. 9 scorched rooms, iron hooks embedded into stone walls, bloodstains so deep they had soaked into the mortar, and a central chamber with scorched black chains dangling from the ceiling. At the centre stood a stone altar, partially melted from heat. Nearby lay the remains of bones, half-charred, fragmented, mixed with ash. Dr. Tully's report later described the find in chilling detail. The remains appear to be human, multiple individuals, burned in place. Several show evidence of pre-mortem trauma, deep cuts, blunt force injuries, and signs of malnutrition. The exact number of victims could never be confirmed, but Tully estimated at least 12. In a locked drawer inside Crawford's courthouse office, somehow untouched by fire, the marshals found one last item, a red leather-bound journal, stamped with the initials HC. Inside were handwritten entries Crawford had made in his final days. They were not legal writings, but ritual instructions. Begin with fire, purify the air, bind the final 9 in silence. No more trials, no more records, only flame and soul. When the blood is ash, the door will open. Beneath that final line, scrawled in ink so dark it had bled through the page. I have judged, I have burned, I am free. The official government report. The marshals left Millfield after 2 weeks. Their official report, delivered to the Department of Justice, read, no surviving evidence of unlawful executions found. Judge Crawford presumed dead in structural collapse. Courthouse deemed structurally unsound and sealed by federal order. The report made no mention of the altar, no mention of the basement chambers, no mention of the journal. All records were sealed, forgotten. Whitmore's last sermon, only one man refused to forget. Shaken, hollow-eyed, a shell of the preacher who had once arrived full of revivalist fire, delivered one last sermon before leaving Millfield forever. He spoke before 5 people. You think this was one man's madness, but evil doesn't begin with madness, it begins with silence. It begins with a judge no one questions, a basement no one enters, a smell no one talks about. It begins when we believe the law is holy and stop asking if the law is just. He left no one knows where. Millfield after the fall. The town of Millfield never recovered. The school closed a year later. The inn burned down. The church was boarded up after vandals carved scripture backwards into the doors. By 1870, Millfield was barely a whisper. By 1885, it was gone from most maps. All that remains is a marker on the edge of a pine-covered hill. Millfield Courthouse, established 1865, destroyed 1867, site under federal control. No mention of Judge Crawford, no mention of 89 vanished men, no mention of fire or blood or bone. But if you ask the right old folks in East Texas, if you press them, they'll tell you, don't follow the smoke if you see it near the pines. That's where the judge still walks.
Closing hook.
Low heartbeat and rising static. The government sealed Millfield's story behind a wall of silence, but what the marshals found that summer, what they buried, didn't stay buried. In part 6, the curse of Crawford's justice spreads beyond Millfield. A railroad worker disappears, a pastor's son dreams of chains, and something ancient stirs beneath Texas soil. Absolutely. Here is part 6 of your 10-part historical horror series, The Millfield Courthouse Murders, designed for a 30-minute YouTube horror storytelling episode. In this chapter, we explore what happened after the investigation, how the curse of Crawford began to spread beyond Millfield, infecting nearby communities and haunting innocent lives.
Part 6, Echoes in the Pines. Intro narration, slow heartbeat,
layered with distant screams and wind through trees. They sealed the courthouse, they buried the journals, they filed their reports. But evil, once invited, doesn't wait politely in a tomb. It moves, it hunts, and in East Texas, it remembered every soul who looked away. 1870, the rails reach Millfield. 3 years after the courthouse burned, the Houston and Great Northern Railroad began laying tracks near the overgrown ruins of Millfield. The land was cheap, quiet, unclaimed. A construction crew of 23 men was hired to survey the old town, clear the brush, and establish a temporary rail station. They worked for 5 days. On the 6th, 7 men were gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints, just missing. The story of Jesse Harrow. One of the workers, a 19-year-old named Jesse Harrow, had been sleeping in a tent near the courthouse ruins. He was found the next morning standing barefoot in the ashes, muttering scripture with his eyes rolled back. Let the law be fulfilled in pain. Let the stone drink the blood of the guilty. When questioned, he claimed someone had whispered to him from beneath the floorboards. He's still there, Jesse said. The judge, he's been watching, waiting. He's in the foundation, he never left. Jesse was later committed to the Travis State Lunatic Asylum in Austin, where he painted basements, altars, and 9 chained figures over and over again, even though he'd never been told the courthouse had a basement. The Reverend's son. In 1871, in the nearby town of New Liberty, a pastor named Elias Vance reported strange behavior from his youngest son, Daniel. The boy had started sleepwalking, often ending up in the cellar, curled up against the foundation wall, whispering things in Latin. Daniel had never been taught Latin. He would wake up screaming, "They're not gone, Pa. They're beneath us, still in the dark." When Elias questioned him, the boy said he had seen a man in a black robe standing in the woods, holding a Bible upside down. The pastor dismissed it as a nightmare, until Daniel etched 9 vertical slashes into the church pews and claimed they're almost free. The Pine Grove testimony. By the mid-1870s, the abandoned site of Millfield had become an unofficial gathering place for drifters and outcasts, some searching for shelter, others chasing rumours. A travelling preacher named Samuel Alden, who had once known Reverend Whitmore, visited Millfield in 1874 and kept a diary of what he experienced. In one entry he wrote, "The air is wrong here. It hums. At night I saw lights glowing from beneath the old courthouse foundation. Not firelight, something colder. Something green! I heard voices praying, but not to God. One voice, one deeper than the rest. It said, 'You are late, preacher. The trial has begun.'" Alden was later found hanging from the rafters of a collapsed church outside Palestine, Texas, with a noose made of judicial robe fabric. The pattern spreads. In county records across East Texas from 1870 to 1885, there are dozens of oddly similar disappearances. Men sentenced for petty crimes who were never seen again. reports of judges becoming increasingly erratic or claiming divine visions, court basements being sealed for renovations and never reopened. Some whispered that Crawford's mission hadn't died with him, that his doctrine of purification had spread through his journals, through dreams, through whispers in the dark. It became known as the doctrine of the ninth flame. A belief that 9 souls must always be judged to keep some ancient force appeased. The Pine Fire. In 1882, a wildfire erupted in the pine forests just outside where Millfield had once stood. It was massive, fast, and inexplicably burned in a perfect spiral, centered on the foundation of the courthouse. Locals reported seeing figures in the fire, men in chains walking calmly through the smoke. The blaze destroyed 30 square miles before stopping at the rail line, like it had hit an invisible wall. The fire line left behind a symbol burned into the earth, a perfect circle with 9 vertical lines inside. That night, 3 towns in the region reported simultaneous mass nightmares. Witnesses described a judge without eyes, calling names from a book written in blood.
Unsealed. In 1885,
a government land survey team returned to Millfield to clear the site for timber harvesting. They were the first to officially reopen the foundation beneath the courthouse, which had remained untouched for 18 years. They found a staircase leading down, still intact, the stone altar cracked but whole, 9 wooden nameplates, all blank. In the farthest corner, beneath a heavy slab of limestone, they found a full skeleton, still in judicial robes, kneeling. Arms outstretched, the skull had been smashed, but beside it was a journal. The last entry read, "I am the 10th." Those echoes of rattling chains and fading hymn. They say justice is blind, but sometimes justice sees too much. Sometimes justice demands blood, and sometimes justice survives the fire. In part 7, the truth about Judge Crawford's origins begins to surface. A letter from Virginia, a secret society, and a deeper evil rooted in the American past. Absolutely. Here's part 7 of your 10-part horror series, The Millfield Courthouse Murders, written in a dark, immersive style for a 30-minute YouTube storytelling episode. This chapter reveals the origins of Judge Harrison Crawford and the disturbing connections to a pre-war secret society. The 10th Doctrine. Intro narration, layered whispers under somber strings. No one is born a monster. They are carved patiently, carefully by the hands of ideology, isolation, and doctrine. What Judge Harrison Crawford believed wasn't madness, it was tradition.
The Richmond Letter.
In 1894, nearly 3 decades after the fire that consumed the Millfield Courthouse, a sealed letter was discovered in a forgotten safety deposit box at Richmond National Bank in Virginia. It was addressed to the Honorable J.H. Crawford, Millfield, Texas. It had never been sent. Inside was a folded parchment bearing the wax seal of a long-defunct legal society, the Order of Divine Rectitude. The letter read, "Brother Crawford, the committee acknowledges your progress in the ritual of 9. Your dedication honours our ancestors, and your sacrifices will not go unnoticed. The flame purifies, the silence seals, the 10th will open the gate. Beware interference. Your work must remain unseen."
R.A.
Whitlock, Chief Archivist, the Hall of Judges, Lexington, Virginia. The Order of Divine Rectitudes and historians who investigated the letter discovered references to an elite circle of antebellum jurists, mostly from Virginia and Georgia, who believed in a hybrid doctrine of law, theology, and esoteric ritual. They called themselves the Order of Divine Rectitude. Their belief? That true justice could not be administered through flawed earthly courts, that souls had to be purified through suffering, particularly those who had broken both legal and divine laws. The order met in secret, maintained no public records, and passed their beliefs through ritual trials held deep beneath courthouses, private estates, and even abandoned plantations. Only 10 judges were ever allowed to hold the title of Executors of the Ninth Flame at any given time. Crawford was one of them. Crawford's initiation. Documents recovered from University of Virginia archives suggest that Crawford's obsession with divine justice began during his law school years in the 1850s. He was mentored by Professor Rutledge Carr, a known member of the order. Carr's lectures were not part of any curriculum, but invited students like Crawford into closed-door colloquiums where they discussed blood atonement, moral transgression, and the sacred authority of the judge as executioner. One note from Crawford's journal, found in the Millfield Courthouse years later, read, "Professor Carr said, 'The bench is not a seat, it is an altar, and the gavel is a hammer of sacrifice.' I understood him." After graduation, Crawford briefly disappeared from public record. Researchers now believe he travelled to Georgia and North Carolina, visiting secret chambers used by the order, learning the ritual of 9, and preparing for the role he would later fulfill in Millfield. The Ninth Flame Doctrine. Here's what the surviving fragments of the doctrine reveal. Each executor must purify 9 guilty souls, not for justice, but for spiritual fire. Each soul must suffer not only death, but awareness of their guilt. Only after the 9th may the judge offer the 10th soul himself to complete the cycle. What happens after that? The doctrine is vague, but refers to a veil that will part and a judgment deeper than death. The disciples return. In the early 1900s, scattered court records across Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi show the emergence of judges and lawyers using similar language to that found in Crawford's journal. The sacred duty of the bench, purification by confinement. The 9th must never speak. In 1903, a small-town judge in Vicksburg was arrested after human remains were found beneath his chambers. He claimed, "I did only what Crawford began. The 10th is coming. The gate is almost ready." The hidden chamber in Lexington. In 1921, during renovations to an old courthouse in Lexington, Virginia, workers broke through a stone wall beneath the old archives wing. What they found was a sealed chapel. At its centre, a wooden judge's bench flanked by 9 stone stools. Behind it, etched into the wall, were the words, "Through law flame, through flame judgment, through judgment, the gate." 9 nameplates were found. One read, H, Crawford Executor 8 of 10. The 10th? Still blank. The doctrine survives. Despite efforts to suppress the order's records, copies of their doctrine began appearing on underground esoteric forums in the 1990s, fueling conspiracy theories and urban legends. Some claimed that secret trials were still held in abandoned courthouses, or that modern judges were continuing the ritual in remote jails. One chilling post on a now deleted forum in 2008 read, "9 more sentenced, 1 remains. Praise the 10th. Final note from Whitmore's papers. Among Reverend Whitmore's recovered notes left anonymously at a church in Dallas in 1938 was a single handwritten page. Crawford did not invent the 9th flame. He fulfilled it, but he was also deceived. He believed he would be judged last. But the 10th is not man. The 10th is what comes when 9 flames open the door. It was never about justice. It was always about the door." Closing hook, rising chant under fading gavel. The deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes. Millfield wasn't the beginning. Crawford wasn't alone. In Part 8, a forgotten asylum reopens its archives. Former patients claim to have seen the judge, and a new generation begins to hear the gavel in their dreams. Absolutely. Here's Part 8 of your 10-part historical horror series, The Millfield Courthouse Murders, tailored for a 30-minute dark horror storytelling video. This chapter takes us to an abandoned asylum where new voices echo the horrors of Millfield, even decades later and miles away. Part 8, The Judge in the Walls. Intro narration, low strings, faint whispers behind slow footsteps on stone. The fire at Millfield ended the courthouse, but it didn't end the trial, because justice, once twisted, doesn't fade. It spreads, and in the silent corridors of a forgotten asylum, the gavel fell again. 1927, the Pine Hill Asylum. In the dense pine woods outside Tyler, Texas, sat a decaying mental hospital once known as the Pine Hill Institution for the Criminally Insane. Opened in 1891, Pine Hill housed over 400 patients at its peak, most of them transferred from overcrowded jails, prisons and workhouses across the South. The facility closed abruptly in 1927, not for financial reasons, but because of what doctors would later call an outbreak of shared hallucination. Patient 132, Jacob Hess. Jacob Hess was admitted in 1924 after being declared criminally insane for assaulting a judge in Nacogdoches during sentencing. He was calm upon arrival, quiet, polite, and deeply religious. That changed after 6 months. He began scratching symbols into the walls of his cell. Circles with 9 vertical slashes, a gavel over a burning flame, a door made of stone cracking open. He refused food, claiming, "The judge says I must fast." That suffering brings purity. He spoke of the 9th flame, a term no one at Pine Hill recognized. When asked who the judge was, Jacob whispered, "He comes at night, tall, in robes, no eyes, only fire. He holds court when the order sleeps." The midnight sessions. By early 1925, more than a dozen patients began to exhibit the same symptoms, speaking in legal terminology they had never been taught, referring to the verdict, to scribbling court transcripts into their bed sheets, screaming the phrase, "He is still reading the names!" A night nurse, Della Whitcomb, kept secret notes during the worst months. Her entries included, "Patients line up in the dark, no prompting. At midnight, they stand in silence facing the east wall, as if waiting to be judged. One whispered, 'We are 9, we just need one more.'" The 9th Ward incident. Pine Hill's 9th Ward, where violent patients were held, became the centre of the outbreak. In the spring of 1926, the locks to the 9th Ward were found broken from the inside, though there was no sign of tools or external tampering. Security staff discovered all 9 patients, standing in a perfect circle, with arms raised, eyes rolled back, chanting in Latin, phrases later identified as from Judge Crawford's journal. They were immediately sedated. 2 nurses later resigned, claiming to have seen a figure in robes walking down the hallway, his face covered by a scorched cloth, his steps making no sound. Dr. Isaac Varnell's notes. Pine Hill's lead physician, Dr. Isaac Varnell, was skeptical of the supernatural until his own encounter. He stayed overnight in the asylum in October 1926 to investigate reports of phantom court sessions. He wrote in a private journal, At 2:17 a.m, I heard a gavel. No one else was on the floor. Then voices, muffled, reciting names, 9 names, over and over. When I opened the old records room, I saw papers moving on their own. One sheet fluttered to my feet. It was blank until the name Thomas Burke burned into it. Thomas Burke was the first man to disappear in Judge Crawford's courtroom back in 1866. Varnell turned over his findings to the Texas Bureau of Health, who declared the report delusional and sealed Pine Hill within 6 months.
The Silent Wing!
After Pine Hill closed, researchers and ghost hunters began exploring the property. In 1974, a graduate student named Elise Barron broke into the old asylum with a tape recorder. Her final recording, recovered from her satchel near the old 9th Ward, contains her whispering, "The courtroom's still here. I hear chains. Wood creaking, a voice calling out numbers. He's holding court in the walls.
Oh, God!
I hear the 10th name." Her body was never found.
The judge
Beyond the grave. Throughout the 20th century, asylums, courthouses, and prisons across the South reported similar phenomena. Unexplained gavel sounds at night, patients or inmates speaking of a judge without eyes, 9 scratches appearing in cells, carved from the inside, dreams of being sentenced in a burning courtroom. Some survivors described waking up to find burns in the shape of scales on their palms or chests. A nurse's letter from 1968, a retired nurse named Clara Dempsey, who had worked in the old Pine Hill Annex before its closure, sent a letter to a local newspaper decades later. "There's something beneath that place. It followed the last of them there. Crawford didn't die in Millfield, he died in Pine Hill, but not in body, in belief. They brought the doctrine with them. It lives where the desperate are confined. Closing hook, quiet ticking clock ending with a slow gavel strike. Crawford is long gone, but the trial never stopped, and the courtroom may be closer than we think." In part 9, we return to Millfield, where a new discovery beneath the ruins finally reveals what happened to the missing 89, but what's unearthed might have never been meant to be found. Here's part 9 of your 10-part historical horror series, The Millfield Courthouse Murders, written in immersive, unsettling style for a 30-minute YouTube horror storytelling video. In this chapter, the truth beneath the courthouse ruins is finally unearthed, and the answers are more terrifying than anyone imagined.
Nala.
Part 9, The Chamber of 89. Intro narration, distant echoes, wind under creaking timbers.
For over a century, the land where the Millfield Courthouse once stood was silent. The fire had erased the building, but not the truth, because beneath the ashes, the foundation remained, and beneath the foundation, something was waiting. 2004, Millfield Historical Society. In early 2004, the Millfield Historical Society received a federal grant to develop a heritage park on the old courthouse site. The plan was simple: rebuild a historical replica of the 1865 courthouse, install plaques commemorating Reconstruction-era justice, attract tourism to a forgotten corner of East Texas. But during excavation, the backhoe struck something solid. A buried door made of reinforced iron, its hinges rusted shut, its frame sealed with limestone and mortar. The workers assumed it was an old drainage system, until they found the padlocks, 4 of them, custom forged, engraved with Latin phrases. One phrase read, "Sanguis lex, lex ignis." Blood is law. Law is fire. The chamber is opened. The town council called in a historical excavation team from Austin. Among them was Dr. Rebecca Ames, a forensic archaeologist specializing in 19th century architecture. She recorded the entire process. The door was sealed from the inside, she noted. Whoever shut it never planned to leave. What they uncovered behind that door would change everything.
The room below justice.
The staircase descended at a steep angle, leading to a vaulted chamber 30 feet beneath the courthouse foundation. The room was built in stone, arched ceilings, walls blackened with soot. It was silent, too silent, like the air had been removed from the space. At the centre stood a raised platform, like a judge's bench, flanked by 9 wooden chairs, each facing inward. Carved into the stone floor were names, 89 of them, every man who had disappeared, and beneath each name a date, followed by a symbol, a flame, a gavel, or a sealed door. The devices! To the left of the platform, behind a heavy iron gate, the team discovered a chamber of instruments, each more horrific than the last. Iron masks designed to muffle screams, restraint frames, implements of starvation and isolation, shallow stone troughs stained with something that had long ago dried. But what chilled the team most were the rows of journals, each bound in thick leather, handwritten in Crawford's unmistakable script. They weren't court logs, they were confessions, rituals, prayers. One journal simply read, "They come to me unclean, I give them fire. The soul is made holy in agony. The 9th flame is satisfied, the 10th watches from beyond."
The survivor's room.
In a side chamber, they found 7 wooden pallets, each with a small metal plate above it, etched with a name. One of the names was Samuel Morrison. Each pallet was surrounded by tally marks scratched into the stone, hundreds of them, as if someone had counted the days, or the screams. Next to one pallet was a spoon, sharpened. Next to another, a small cross, carved from bone.
The final journal.
Dated June 11th, 1867, just days before the courthouse fire, contained a chilling passage. "The 89th soul has been cleansed. I see the gate now, in dreams, in voices that echo beneath the stone. They tell me it is almost time. I will light the fire myself." There were no further entries. The last page was stained with something dark and burned at the edges.
The skeletons in the walls.
When excavation teams began dismantling the rear stone walls of the chamber, they discovered narrow cavities, hidden compartments no wider than a man's shoulders. Inside them were bones, human bones, stacked vertically, braced into the wall like bricks. Each cavity held the remains of one man, positioned upright, arms crossed over chest, mouths open, and each cavity was numbered, 1 through 89. The whispered recording. Dr. Rebecca Ames had brought a portable audio recorder into the chamber to document her observations. On playback, the team heard something strange. At the 14-minute mark, while she examined the judge's bench, a second voice, deep, crackling and barely audible, whispered, "Witness! Witness! The court is not adjourned." Audio engineers confirmed there had been no one else in the room at the time of recording.
The burned sigil.
After the discovery, the town moved quickly to seal the chamber, citing public safety and emotional trauma to the community. But before the door was closed forever, one final image was released to the public. A sigil burned into the back of Crawford's bench. It depicted a blindfolded figure holding scales in one hand and a flame in the other. Beneath it, in Latin, Preceptum decimum, intus ostium, the 10th doctrine, the door within.
The chamber is sealed again.
The town never rebuilt the courthouse. Instead, the site was fenced off, and no further excavation was permitted. But strange reports began again, locals hearing knocking from underground, children dreaming of a man in robes calling roll, a faint smell of burned wood and lime drifting through the pines on windless nights. One local pastor, Reverend Collins, attempted a midnight prayer service at the site. He left before dawn, refusing to speak about what he heard. He simply said, "The trial never ended. He's still reading the names." Closing hook, slowly rising organ chords under fire crackling, 89 names carved in stone, 89 souls sealed in darkness, and still, one seat remains at the bench. In the final part of our series, Part 10, we return to Reverend Whitmore's final days. What did he find before his mind collapsed? And who, or what, has now taken the judge's seat? 10, the final chapter of your 10-part historical horror series, The Millfield Courthouse Murders. This 30-minute episode closes the circle, revealing what happened to Reverend Whitmore and what awaits those who dare uncover the judge's legacy.
Part 10. Intro narration, low ambient hum, faint beneath echoing footsteps.
The chamber was sealed, the names were counted, the dead accounted for. But Judge Harrison Crawford's story did not end in the fire or in the bones beneath Millfield. Because justice, when corrupted, does not die, it evolves.
70. The Asylum Journal.
3 years after the courthouse fire, Reverend Thomas Whitmore was committed to the First Methodist Sanatorium in Galveston. Diagnosed with religious mania and obsessive guilt delusions, he remained locked away in a private room where he was said to speak with invisible presences and refused to sleep more than a few hours each night. His doctors described him as polite, articulate, and utterly haunted. Whitmore's final confession. In April of 1872, Whitmore requested a visit from Methodist Bishop Ira Coleman, a friend from his seminary days. Coleman wrote an account of that visit, sealed in the church archives until 1996, when it was finally published. In it, Whitmore whispered, "I saw the trial, not just what he did, Ira. I saw the courtroom beneath this world. The gavel doesn't stop. The names are read by fire. He isn't judging them. He's feeding something." Coleman dismissed it as trauma-induced delusion until Whitmore handed him a worn page from a leather-bound journal, burned around the edges. It was written in Crawford's handwriting, and it contained Whitmore's own name.
As the 90th.
"I was never supposed to leave," Whitmore said. "He marked me, and now he's waiting to finish the list." The 90th name records confirm Whitmore died in 1872 of heart failure at 3:13 a.m. during a thunderstorm. The nurse on duty reported something else. He sat up in bed, eyes wide, and whispered, "The door has opened." Then the windows shattered, though no one else on the ward heard a thing. His room, room 9B, was permanently closed afterward. Modern day to 2013. In 2013, amateur historian and YouTuber Gabe Rutledge began researching the Millfield disappearances. His goal was a documentary series. After months of research, he claimed to have discovered Crawford's personal Bible at an estate sale in Southern Virginia. In one of his final video updates, Gabe said, "I found a list, handwritten, the same 89 names, but there's a 90th scratched in at the bottom. It's not Whitmore, it's mine." 2 weeks later, Gabe vanished. His equipment was found abandoned in a motel room near Millfield. His final recording, posted automatically to his channel via scheduled upload, shows him reading from the Bible. At timestamp 21:44, the camera glitches, a gavel sound echoes, and Gabe says, barely audible, "The trial has resumed." The 10th Doctrine. In 2022, Professor Amelia Knox of Baylor University published a controversial paper titled The 10th Doctrine, Crawford and the Cult of Judicial Ascension. Knox's theory: Crawford wasn't just a deluded sadist, he believed he was completing a spiritual transformation, using the suffering of others to open a metaphysical door. Her paper argues that Crawford created a system of ritualized suffering, carefully selected the number 9 as sacred, left the 10th seat empty, intended not for a victim, but a successor. One chilling quote from the judge's journal supports her theory. 10 seats, 9 to bear witness, 1 to carry the fire forward. Justice is eternal, and so must be its vessel.
A pattern across time.
Since the Millfield discovery, reports have surfaced of similar patterns in abandoned courthouses in Alabama, basement cells in Missouri, even a hidden wing in a Louisiana monastery turned prison, each site linked to mysterious disappearances, unexplained symbols, 9 names listed, and always 1 empty chair. 25. Present day. The land where the Millfield Courthouse once stood is now under state surveillance. Entry is restricted. The official reason: unstable terrain. But former Sheriff Dale Rowan, now retired, wrote in a private blog, "I've been there, the ground hums, you feel it in your bones. Sometimes I hear footsteps, but no one's behind me. That courtroom's still down there, still full, still waiting." Some believe the trial ended with the fire. Some believe Crawford is Longhead. But others believe he never left. That he is now more than a man. A force. A presence that finds its way into the minds of judges, wardens, that interrogators, anyone entrusted with authority and judgment, and once the 10th seat is filled, the court resumes. Closing narration. Slow swell of sound like a closing door. 89 names carved into stone, 1 burned into scripture, and 1 more, maybe yours, waiting to be read next. Thank you for walking with us through the darkest corners of history. If you're still listening, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, the court is never truly adjourned.